All right, in this lecture, I want to dig a little bit deeper into the switch function. And as we saw, switch is a logical function that evaluates an expression against a list of values and then returns one of multiple possible expressions. So let's break this down a little bit and look at the individual parameters of the switch function. So first up, we have the expression. And this expression can be any DAX expression that returns a single scalar value that can be evaluated multiple times. And examples of this include things like, month ID from a calendar table or a product lookup product group. But really, this DAX expression can be any sort of expression that can be evaluated and then return a single scalar value. Next up, we have our value and results pair. And the value portion of this is a list of values that is produced by the expression. So month ID values are our example here. And each of those values is then paired with a result to return for that row where the case matches. So a really common example of when to use switch is to create something like month names in a calendar table based on the month ID. And one thing to keep in mind here is that the match has to be exact, right? You can't use comparison operators like greater than or less than. You have to use equal to. And you see here that we start off this expression with switch, and then the expression that we want to evaluate is the calendar month ID. So where the calendar month ID equals 1, the result we want to return is January. Where the calendar month ID equals 2, the result we want to return is February. Where it equals 3, it would be March, and so on and so forth. Right? So pretty easy to understand. It's just important to remember that when you're using switch by itself, you have to think of it as equal to. And the last parameter here is the else clause. And this is just the value that's returned if the expression doesn't actually match any value of the argument. Pretty straightforward here with the different parameters in the inputs. Switch comes in really handy when you're looking to replace nested if statements or use comparison operators other than equal. Right? So this pattern of switch true is a very common pattern to help in those cases. Now, we'll walk through a couple of these in a moment here. So let's go jump into Power BI and we'll check this out for ourselves. All right, so we're back in Power BI and I'm going to jump over into my calendar table. And I want to create a new calculated column for month number. And I know that we already have one. We had created this using the query editor. But again, you can create calculated columns in different places, the query editor or with DAX. So for this example, I want to practice creating the same month number column using DAX. So come up here and let's add a new column. And to start off this demo, we're going to name this month number and we'll just call it, DAX. So let's say that somebody asked you to create a column for month number. And you're basically saying where the month name equals January, then return 1, where it equals February, then return 2. So on and so forth, just like the example we walked through in the slides. You might think to start with something like an if function, right? So here we want to test our calendar month name, right? And what we want to say is where this equals January, we want to return 1. If that's false, we need to test again where our month name equals February, we want to return 2. Where that's false, we want to test if our month name equals March, we want to return 3. I'm just going to add in an other clause here to basically wrap up this function, and then we've got to close out all of our parentheses. Right? But you can see here how messy this starts to get. Right? You need an if statement for each one of these. Basically end up with this case where you've got these multiple nested if statements. You got to make sure all your parentheses lined up. It's tough to kind of type out and tell the clauses and what belongs to what. And we can see here that it does work, right? But again, it's just messy. It's not very efficient. It's a lot of DAX to write, right? So what if we remove this? And instead, we want to update this using the switch function. Right, so here we're going to start typing in switch, and then our first parameter here is the expression that we want to evaluate. And just like with our nested if statements that we just worked through, it's still the month name that is going to be the expression that we want to evaluate. And now here we move through our different value and results pairs, right? So where we equal January, we want that to equal 1. For February, we want that to equal 2. And then one pro tip here, if you hold down Alt, Shift, and then press the down arrow, it'll copy the last line of DAX code. So you can actually do that, and that might end up being a little quicker. There's still a lot to replace here, but it is a helpful tip sometimes when you've got a lot to type out. So we'll go through here. We'll type out the rest of our value and result pairs. June 6th, July 7. August is going to equal 8. September will be 9. Then one of the great things about this too is if you are creating a non-standard calendar, maybe your year actually starts July 1, right? So you want that to be like your start of year column, right? So July would end up being the first month of the year. This is an easy way to kind of go through and assign those values for non-standard calendars. October 10, and I accidentally hit enter there. So we'll go November 11, December 12. So one thing to note there, I'm actually going to leave that without the quotes around 12. And I'll show you what we get here. We have a variant data type, right? So one of the things with switch is we can't say, hey, check this text value and then return an integer, right? You have to make sure that they're both kind of assigned as text, which is why I'm putting the quotes around it. And so if you see this variant data type error, there's a mismatch between the data types that are trying to be used or returned. So just watch out for those. And then here we can add in our optional else clause, and we'll just write that as other. So if for some reason there was another month that was returned or some sort of error, we would get that other message. All right, so it looks good here. So we got 1 through 12. All right, so that's the switch function, and this comes in pretty handy, again, when you're trying to replace multiple nested if statements. Now, let's take a look at a slightly different example here. And I want to jump over to my product lookup table. And let's say, for example, we want to create a new calculated column called price point, right? And we want to basically say, we're going to create a range of prices, right, for high, medium, and low. So let's call this price point, right? And basically, let's try to use the switch function again. And we're going to evaluate the product price column. But here, what we want to say is basically where the product price is greater than, and you can see that we're already getting an error message here, is greater than 500, we want to return high. Or if it's greater than 100, we want to return mid-range, otherwise low, right? This is basically the logic that we want. But remember, we were talking about in the slides that switch doesn't support other comparison operators besides equal to, right? So you can't use greater than, less than, greater than, or equal to. You can only use the equal to operator. So this is not an acceptable expression to use as part of the switch statement. So what we need to do is we're actually going to add in true here, right? And then we slightly need to rewrite our logic, right? So we're going to say return true if our product price is greater than 500, right? We're going to return high. And then we're going to say product price. I'm actually going to lock this in, and then we'll walk through exactly what is going on here, right? So basically what's happening here is by adding true in, we're still testing for equivalence using switch, but we're actually just trying to understand if the result of the test is true. And then we're going to return the value if it is. So what happens here is this first argument is product price greater than 500. If that is true, we want to return high. If it's false, move on to the next argument. Okay, is product price greater than 100? If that's true, return mid-range. If it's false, move on to the next argument. And here all we're doing is saying, hey, if none of the above are true, then return low, right? So basically this is kind of our else clause here, or saying that differently, if both of these expressions evaluate to false, then return low. So there you have it. That's switch and switch true. And this expression and the pattern of switch true can come in super handy when you're trying to evaluate columns of data and then return a value.